What is up, everybody? Mr. Purtis here. Welcome to unit number 8. This whole unit, which is our second to last unit, is on the Cold War and decolonization. So two different pieces kind of combined together, which do interact a little bit. By Cold War, we're talking about the United States versus the Soviet Union, which we'll get to in a second. By decolonization, we're talking about the end of imperialism. Remember, go back to Unit 6 and the Europeans going out and conquering. We're going to end that post-World War II. So this is 8.1. This is on the Cold War. Let's rock and roll. Let's get going here. Here's a little contextualization. World War II is fought, and the United States and the Soviet Union are on the same side in World War II. But I didn't really mention this in Unit 7, but they don't really like each other. It's kind of your friends close, friends close and enemies closer kind of thing. Or this idea that the two sides, the Soviet Union and the U.S., almost like they have a joint enemy and this like ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend who they just both hate and they want to destroy. So they team up to destroy this ex who is Nazi Germany, and they just want to like obliterate this one country or this girlfriend or boyfriend. And then once that boyfriend is out of the picture, now the two of them look at each other again. They're like, yeah, we still hate each other a lot. So the U.S. and the Soviet Union are going to emerge as superpowers after World War II. And even though they were on the same side in World War II, they don't like each other. This shift of the U.S. and the Soviet Union becoming superpowers is a huge difference from pre-World War II, where really Britain and France was the center of power in the world after World War I. And now France and Britain are kind of on the decline as a result of fighting in World War II, and the U.S. and the Soviet Union emerge as kind of the two powers. Now, they're very different, which we'll get to in a second, but the question becomes is, how do we avoid future war? Remember, World War I was a huge failure in terms of keeping the peace. So the question after World War II is, and a lot of the people who are alive after World War II were alive after World War I, and they're the decision makers. They want to say, how can we avoid another war? We want to make sure we avoid World War III. So the Cold War, essentially, at its root, is an ideological conflict. This is a big fancy word here that really just means ideas. So it's a difference between ideas. So instead of saying they had difference in ideas, you say an ideological difference, and then you just sound super smart. So there's this ideological conflict and a power struggle really between the United States, who is capitalist, okay, and the Soviet Union, who is this communist, socialist at their root. The U.S. hates communism and socialism, and the Soviet Union believes this capitalist system is horrible for the world and for workers, and it just leads to an inequality of wealth. So the two sides, because of this ideological difference between the two, are going to compete around the world after World War II to essentially get allies on their side. It was once taught to me and kind of explained to me, it's almost like free agents in sports. You have all these options out there of people to recruit on your team, and you want to offer them as much as you can to get them to join your side. And in this case, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are going to go out, and these countries that are either getting their independence or countries that are trying to rebuild after World War II, both are going to try and recruit them to be part of essentially their team. And they're really going to compete three ways. One is getting allies on your side. 2 is building up of nuclear weapons. And 3 is the space race. I'm going to go through each of these kind of quickly just to give you a quick little overview. This is called the Cold War because the Soviet Union and the United States never actually go to war with each other during this whole period. They compete with each other. There's threats of war. There's thoughts that war is going to happen in like 61 and 62, but like the two sides never fight. The two sides fight wars during the Cold War, but never directly against each other. Okay, so that's kind of an important part. It's called a Cold War because a hot war is when people are fighting. Cold War is like when we're tense and we think it's going to happen and we're competing, but the war never actually happens. So here's our 3 A's. One is alliances. There's going to be 2 defensive military alliances. These are not offensive alliances. These are defensive, meaning that if one of these countries on your side is invaded, you will join with them to fight. On the blue countries here are NATO. That's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This starts right after World War II, and it's an alliance between democratic countries, and they agree that if any of them are invaded by a communist country or by anyone else, that they will all come to the aid. So we got Canada and the United States here, and then all of these Western European countries, as well as Turkey. More countries are in this today. NATO has expanded since the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But this is what it looks like at the time. And then we have the Warsaw Pact. This is the response to NATO, where the communist countries, led by the Soviet Union here, are going to join forces in a military alliance together. So there's that. Some countries decide that they are not going to join either NATO or the Warsaw Pact. And these are called non-aligned countries. When something is aligned, it's together with something else. So you want your wheels aligned so they can all drive correctly. Non-aligned is when countries don't join with something or against something else. And in this case, there's a non-aligned movement around the world where countries are kind of like, bro, we don't want to be part of the US or the Soviet Union side. We don't want to be part of either of these. We want to just be neutral and kind of do our own thing. Most of these countries are countries that were involved in imperialism, and as they get their independence, they don't want to feel like they're colonized again by being part of one of these two sides. And there's 120 countries that are part of this non-aligned movement, where either they say, we're not joining either side, or they're kind of like, oh, we'll take money from both sides. Like, you want to help us out? We'll take whatever. So I just want to point out that not everyone is involved in this Cold War. And you can see the countries in blue, which if you remember back to our imperialism stuff, these are the countries that are primarily imperialized, whether directly or through economic imperialism like we saw in Latin America. The other ways we're going to compete is, one is the arms race. The term here that we're going to use is nuclear proliferation. To proliferate something is to increase something. And in this case, we are increasing nuclear weapons. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested the atomic bomb through secret spies and through some underhanded work. They get their hands on the blueprint for the atomic bomb that the U.S. had developed during World War II. They explode their own, and this leads to this tension between the two sides in what is called the arms race, where if the Soviet Union builds 10 atomic weapons, the United States wants to build 30. And when the United States builds 30, the Soviet Union wants to test and have 100. And eventually at its peak, which is 1966, give or take, the United States had roughly 33,000 atomic weapons or nuclear weapons. And the destruction we'll talk about in class, we'll kind of look at what the atomic bomb can do, but this is a huge buildup, and there's tension of where these nuclear bombs are going to go, how far they can reach, can they go over oceans, what are we going to do to protect us? This is all part of this arms race, which is going to reach its pinnacle, at least in the United States, with the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll get to in a future video. The other thing is the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launches the first satellite into space. It is called Sputnik, or Sputnik, which is right here. This is a picture of it. And the U.S. and the government and the people in the U.S. freak out. They're like, oh my gosh, there's a satellite in space. It's going to be spying on us. Who knows what it's going to do? And this race begins of who can send an animal into space? Who can send a person into space? Who can send a ship into space and bring it back again? Who can orbit the Earth? Who can get to the moon first? Who can walk on the moon first? And this competition builds up just in terms of pride and this idea of this kind of final frontier. We know where the whole Earth is now. Let's go beyond the Earth. And in 1969, the United States sends the first astronauts to walk on the moon. It did happen. If you hear anything different, that's just crazy, kooky conspiracy theories. And this is a picture of the American flag because we're competing with the Soviet Union. So what's the first thing we do? Dang, there's our flag. We got the moon. What are you going to do now, Soviet Union? And that's part of this competition. In terms of the nuclear race or the arms race, in the United States, there was tremendous fear that the Soviet Union would attack with an atomic bomb, and people are going to build a lot of these fallout shelters, which is underground areas that you'd stock with food in case an atomic bomb came. You build it into the side of a little hill in your backyard or in your backyard somewhere, or if you couldn't afford it or you live in a city, you could even buy these little pods that you'd close up and protect yourself. So that's what I got. Weird time with this Cold War. If you got grandparents, they might have been alive during this time. They'd probably tell you a little something about it. But that's what I got. You got any questions? You write it down. You let me know. You know the